it's Lou welcoming you to our new series of conversations from Freelands Foundation. Some of you may remember that back in 2022, Larry Achampong and I came together to launch Visualise, the Runnymede Trust and Freelands Foundation report on race and inclusion in secondary school art education. The report examines the current state of race in visual art education at Key Stage 4 in England, confirming what educators have been saying for years, that art education is at a crisis point. Despite their best efforts, teachers and students are rooted in an education system that's failing to nurture diverse art practices. Following the report's publication, I've regrouped with Freelands for this new weekly 5-part series of conversations with art educators, practitioners and makers to dig deeper into the ideas presented by the report and to offer you, our listeners who work in education, a toolkit, if you like, of conversations that we hope will support you in exploring the ideas around providing a more diverse art curriculum for your students. I've included a link to the report and to our guests' work in the show notes that accompany this episode. I hope you enjoy this series of conversations. Hey, it's Lou, and I'm excited to share with you the final episode in this special series with Freelands. And today I'm speaking with Carey Robinson. I first met Carey when she was in her position at the South London Gallery as Head of Learning. And it was Carey who first came to mind for this special episode, where we're looking towards the future of art education and what that could look like for students, but also for us as educators. I've been so inspired by Carey's visionary approach to creating all different types of learning programs, and it's such a pleasure having her join us today. And we'll be talking about her current position at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where she's responsible for the strategic leadership and development of creative learning experiences for a wide range of audiences in her role as the Deputy Director of Learning and Public Programmes. So let's get to the conversation. Well, I know your work really well. I love and know your work really well. But for the listeners who are less familiar with what you do, I'd love for you to share in your own words a little bit about your work in your capacity, maybe for where you are working now, which is at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, and what led you there and what kind of work you were doing there.
I work at the Fitzwilliam Museum at the moment. I've been there for just over 2 years. My role is responsible for leading the design and implementation of strategic arts and creative learning programs across a range of strands. So that's, children and early years and young people, schools and teachers, older adults, and of course the community at large. And that's for Cambridge, that means regional work as well as in the city of Cambridge.
I'd love to hear some or a positive story or something really meaningful that you've seen or experienced or have been part of when we're thinking about good practice in arts programming.
I think one of the things might be useful to talk about is the University Museum. So the Fitzwilliam is part of the University of Cambridge. I'd not worked at a university museum before, so there were a different set of priorities and external influences and forces, if you like. But one of the things that really attracted me to the role was the learning practitioner or learning research team that exists within the department. And the practitioner research is not new, Tate have been doing it for a long time. Emily Pringle's led some good work there for many years. Practice research, practitioner researcher. But at the Fitzwilliam, they've managed to bring in some funding, some research funding that has enabled 3 posts. So there's the practitioner researcher for early childhood, young adults and communities, and also actually a 4th one for older adults. And all of these roles have been changing the way that the organisation has been able to deliver and talk about its work and the impact it's having more particularly. So one of the things that came out of this programme of work, so each of the roles is a sort of funded for 2 years, But David Farrell Banks, he's a communities researcher, practitioner for communities. So he worked with curatorial and the collections and research team to co-curate a community exhibition at the Fitzwilliam with a core group that have been connected to the museum for several years now, linked to the acquisitions. There's the sort of acquisitions policy, and I think as a colleague, Kate Noble, had set up a community advisory group to kind of explore how the museum collects art and disseminates it and talks about it and where are the gaps. Those community advisors have sort of sustained the influence on the museum and started to work in a slightly different way. So we managed to get some funding to produce or present some work. So some of the community members went down to the stores, selected works that weren't on display, went with their intuition, things that they were sort of inspired by or intrigued by, and then did the research, and they became part of a public display called Tensions of Belonging at the museum, and ran a sort of family day with activities and things like that. And so I'm quite interested in that relationship between the institution and the sort of imperative at the moment that many museums have around becoming a sort of civic space, and then what that actually means for communities and how we can open up our collections and how we can think about exhibition making, but also where does that leave us and what does that do for the museum, but also what does it do for our communities, and we're all part of the community, of course, as well. So I'm quite interested in the relationship between people and institutions and how art can facilitate that, influence that, and sort of, it helps us to get through some of the bigger questions today, because we're exploring ideas and questions through our own subjective relationships to objects and then bringing those together.
There's something that I haven't thought of before you said it, and I haven't actually heard anyone else speak of this too much, actually. But I was thinking about how more of our public spaces, not our art institutions, but, our libraries and, the public houses or the sports halls and the village halls and all of these things, as we know, are closing in our communities. So in a way, like our art institutions and our museums and galleries are maybe seeing the effects of that, and maybe that's kind of informing their offerings as well in some way. I don't know, but I'm sure it will do as time moves on. But that was an interesting thought. And I just really love how the work that you cover, or the community that you kind of service, ranges from young to old. So there's just a lot there that you've got to think about. But I was thinking that we could look at the stats, look at the hard stuff and just see where we really are in terms of diversity, the curriculum, and what that means to our students and what that means to them as they move through their education. And the numbers regarding the curriculum and representation at the moment are showing that ethnic minority artists are underrepresented in GCSE exam papers, just 2.3% at the moment of artists that are representative from ethnic minority backgrounds. And we're going back to basics here, but I think it's always good practically to think about why representation matters. I know it's something we've been talking about together for years, but perhaps explore the effects of that. And I'm just thinking of the positive effects, like inspire our teachers. So if they are thinking about trying to be more inclusive and offer better representation to supplement like their curriculum offering, I'd really like to look at how that affects things positively. So perhaps we could zoom in on your previous role at the South London Gallery, if you don't mind, or at the ICA, both inner city galleries, and perhaps share an example of programming that worked well there in terms of its effect and in terms of how it serviced like the people of the community.
I was just about to say that, the differences between Cambridge and London, for example, the pressures are different. I've never worked outside of London before this current role, and diversity, is in a classroom. So one school that I worked with at the South London Gallery had a 97% Black or Latin American cohort, Latino cohort. I don't think I've ever come across a school in Cambridge that shares that demographic. So, some of the stats that you were talking about there around, or in the report as well, around 85% of UK qualified teachers are white. I've seen a statistic that this was only in 2021, that only 1% of head teachers are Black, something like 0.2% of black women are leaders in London schools. So I think, black teachers as well, someone like Jeffrey Boyacci has talked about his experience as a black teacher, and there is evidence around black teachers being more likely to be being put on capability or less likely to be promoted than their white counterparts. So that experience in schools for our black counterparts, whether they're children, teenagers, or educators, is really important that we understand, and start to think about why that is. For me, it's been an interesting and relevant learning experience working in Cambridge after being based in London for my life. It's really clear that diversity must be normalised in all schools and anti-racism, and whether it's a white rural area or a multi-ethnic school in London, but especially in white schools, I would argue, we need to start thinking about race and racism and not feeling that that's outside of our scope, because it's not relevant to our class, our town. The RSA in 2020 ran a discussion it's called How to Be an Anti-Racist Educator. It's still available online, I think. And it revealed that it's the schools with the greatest proportion of white pupils that racism is most likely to occur, and how important it is for teachers, therefore, to reflect on their practice, ask themselves how they can make their approaches and teaching and classroom management more anti-racist. The experiences I've had working in Cambridge, compared to London, so there are a lot of teachers who are already and have for some time been trying to address or grappling with issues around identity or diversifying the curriculum, thinking about the language they use, the references they cite. And it's been quite interesting that actually that RSA reference there to the RSA's research around racism being more prevalent in all white schools, I think is a really important area for us to think about. I think the Visualise report does talk about teacher training, engaging more purposefully and fully with anti-racist practice or tactics and strategies and learning around race and racism, and in arts education or in schools in general. We know that students want to talk about these questions around race and identity, and schools' confidence to support them needs to be supported to do that. Schools need to catch up. Most young people today are engaging with culture digitally. They understand and, celebrate diversity. Youth culture emerges from these sort of media platforms. Diverse people, young people are relaxed with diversity. So I think we need to kind of move on as institutionally, whether that's a museum or a school. It's really important, especially going into the future and the fourth industrial revolution. What skills will our learners need to have? And some of the skills that we gain through art and creative thinking are the skills that we will need for the future. Let me just see if I can find a note around Dr. Claire Stanhope, who I've worked with at the South London Gallery on a project in schools, which was around racial literacy, youth voice. So myself and Sarah Priest from Mountview and Clare and the team at the SLG developed a programme of work that created a youth collective within a school, and this was in Southwark, a very diverse area, lots of young people in the borough. But there was a stark difference between, some of the other projects that were run along similar lines and Claire's approach with other teachers and Claire's approach. And Claire Stanhope is the head of art, and she's a founder of the Centre for Creative Explorations, which is within her own department at a London academy. And it centres creative activism within the school structure. So she runs residencies for artists and student exhibitions. But one of the most striking things about Claire, which was just really empowering, I thought, was around her sense of her own experience and her own identity. She describes herself as a white working class teacher from Northern England, and her experience teaching in a diverse part of London. She felt very, very strongly that her own experience, her own history was sort of impacted by not having a fuller picture. Her approach around sort of pedagogical development through a decolonising lens, and how sort of we can work with, through, and from the structures that our kind of institutions are steeped in, we must start to augment or improve our individual journeys to deliver or support anti-racist education. We need white teachers, those in rural areas, those, up in the Lothians of Scotland, as well as in London, to start really thinking through what are the issues we're trying to solve? What is it that we need? What are the problems? What are we trying to solve? How can we understand this better? And what can I do within my own sphere of influence to progress the work?
When we're not thinking about things that are specific to areas like London or Cambridge, what are the commonalities you think that is shared by the students that they're looking for when they're sitting down in their art class?
So I'm quite interested in ideas about racialization, and the urge to define oneself on one's own terms is really powerful, like in opposition to how most of our black and brown students and colleagues and families are having to see themselves. It's counter to how you want to see yourself. You want to self-define, but we have grown up in a society where that definition has been assigned to you, and it comes with expectations that are negative. So I think, if I was a young black person in a class today, it would be very different to when it was in the 70s when I was a young black person in a classroom. But I would want to be inspired. I would want to have ideas shared with me and to be given space to share my own ideas. And I would want to explore the relationship that I have, with my interior world and the exterior world. And I think we're often sometimes in danger of kind of being reductive around black artists who only make black art, and black kids are only interested in stuff that's, linked to black culture. And I think, teachers, they're incredibly, in an incredibly rich and powerful position. I mean, there's a lot of pressures that teachers are under in delivering the curriculum, and museums and galleries can support some of that. But I think to create some common ground around what that journey should be and how it looks does mean creating some kind of shared purpose and commonality between those two different institutions, educational institutions and cultural institutions. And I guess I'll quickly say that there was that project, My Primary School is at the Museum, in 2017, which, wanted to explore learning outcomes and cultural outcomes for primary school children, if they were more beneficial, if they were learning in a museum setting. And I think there were quite a few positive things that came out of that. But, if we think about the youth sector, the cultural sector, and the education sector, and the issues that we're, all trying to address in our different ways, different sort of priorities, is there a space where we can come to, together around this proposition of the skills for the future, and those ideas around collaboration, imagination, adaptability, those are common to all of us and transferable. Alternative art schools are common, fairly well recognised now, which are trying to circumvent these structural challenges in conventional art spaces and arts education. I mean, the museum sector, the arts sector is not diverse at all. And the teaching from that narrow art canon in a class that's, the overrepresentation of white teaching staff, it does all, have a strangely undermining, potentially, effect on our young people and our colleagues and ourselves. So I think I'd be really wanting someone who wasn't looking at me as a colour and coming at me with expectations of what I would be interested in.
I'm just thinking about practically for teachers who are time poor, overstretched, perhaps overwhelmed. Are we saying perhaps you don't need to be so prescriptive? It's not about literally saying, if I have a child from this background, I need to just present a reflection of them to them in perhaps what else I can find to supplement the curriculum. It can be more expansive than that. It can be more integral to your own development as a practitioner regarding informing yourself and inspiring yourself before you look directly to the student.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why we would encourage arts and cultural engagement in the school, from improving good health and, you know, cognitive abilities and critical skills and all of the things. So you may not become an artist. So I would say, I think partly what I'm saying there is don't give up on the students who say they hate art, because there's still the process of art making and exploring and teaching and experimenting, those rehearsals, those failures, those trying a different way, trying again, or abandoning the thing you're working on, those are really powerful skills. Accepting defeat, those are really powerful things to take through you in life. I mean, I guess I would just say, I would encourage people to look at the Centre for Creative Explorations, which I mentioned earlier, that Claire Stanhope set up. There's an online, I think it's got a website. I would also really practically, I mean, I'm aware, obviously, you've just reiterated the pressures that teachers are under, and often they don't have, there's a sort of competing values thing here, isn't it? It might be easier to wedge a few diverse artists into your sort of session planning, but do we want to think really about what are we trying to do ultimately? Art and creative engagement holds space for complicated emotions, criticality that doesn't have that's not, we're not trying to, I mean, I guess with GCSE you are measuring outcomes, but the process itself is quite open-ended, isn't it? Making art, thinking about art and artists, it's subjective. It's about self-expression, formulating opinions, understanding, the difference between art, historical fact, and personal subjective opinion. I think if I were a teacher, and I am completely aware that I fail as a teacher. I've never done, but so I don't know exactly what a teacher in a school today who's up against these kind of aspirations, but also pressures, needs. I don't feel I can say that, but I have come across some interesting people that I think are worth looking up. So one thing that's easy to access is the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality, Leeds Beckett, and they have an anti-racism framework for initial teacher training. You can find that online and it's free to download. And then someone I came across fairly recently she's called Claire Stewart-Hall, and she's at the University of Oxford, but she's also a coach in education and race. And her work looks at the ways race has been constructed in schools. So I think those are two really sort of practical ways to kind of engage with those people that are working in the space already, and who are committed to working with teachers who do understand the curriculum and the obligations and the pressures of delivering the curriculum. And just, don't be so hard on yourself, as one young person said to me once. But that's for me a really, you only know what you can do within your own sphere of influence and the constraints that you're up against. And I think it is a sort of carefully, accepting that we can't do everything all the time. Everyone's at a different point in their journey. But I really think it's about your relationship to the concept of race and your relationship to, your own racialized identity, whether that's white or black, and really trying to think about constructive ways to circumvent convention, I think, because things are changing down the line. Education's going to be different. The world is going to be different. The skills we need are going to be different. And I think it's preparing yourself and your students for that world.
Hey, it's Lou, just popping back to say thank you for listening to this conversation made in collaboration with Freelands Foundation. Find out more by following the links in the podcast show notes and subscribe to Shade Podcast to catch all the episodes in this series, where we'll be taking a deeper dive into the art curriculum and how we can support each other in affecting change. This series was produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensah. It was mixed by Tess Davidson, and the original music was composed for Shade Podcast by Brian Jackson. I'll see you next time.